Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for March 15th, 2023, the Ides of March. I want to begin by calling your attention to a call for an emergency summit to deal with the accelerating economic and financial crisis, which is moving toward a meltdown. It's an emergency call issued by Helga Zepp-LaRouche. I will have a link to it at the bottom of the description page, but it's a very brief but very effective explanation of the unprecedented crisis that we're now entering into, and the call for a bankruptcy reorganization. Not a call for a great reset or a new world economic order that people are attributing to the Davos crowd and the World Economic Forum, but a sensible approach to how to rebuild the world economy on the basis of principles of the American economic system, which we've abandoned in the United States. We've adopted a neoliberal British system and thrown out the door what we did to build our nation in the past. Now, she's speaking from decades of experience, especially from her knowledge of the work of her husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who has been identified by very serious economists as the most accurate economic forecaster of the last half century. Now, Lyndon LaRouche from 1971 warned of the shift away from a physical economy, an economy based on emphasis on production of physical goods, toward a monetary speculative system, which was put onto that pathway with the decision on August 15th, 1971, to break with the Bretton Woods system, to remove the gold reserve system for the dollar, and to enter into what became a system of floating exchange rates, which favored speculation over long-term investment in physical economic development. The neoliberal policy that he warned about included such things as deregulation, which later on was the 1999 repeal of Glass-Steagall banking regulation. Much of this comes from the mid-1980s Margaret Thatcher policy, the Big Bang policy from the City of London. But deregulation, privatization, that is, getting rid of any government involvement in the economy and turning all of it over to for-profit enterprises, to corporations. The idea of a free market is not a free market. It's a controlled corporate cartel system which removes any potential for governments to operate on behalf of the sovereign interests of the nation. So-called globalization, the rejection of sovereignty, outsourcing, deindustrialization, colonial looting. This is what we've moved to aggressively since 1971. And the hollowing out of Western economy's physical economic capabilities. Now, LaRouche's analysis and his forecasts warned of this over a period of time, and he was repeatedly accurate. For example, just let me give you two examples. In 1987, in the spring of 87, he forecast a stock market crash, which he said would happen in October. It did, but it was not a stock pick by LaRouche. It was a warning that the policy that we had adopted after the Volcker high interest rate policy of the early 80s was creating a speculative bubble, and that it automatically would crash, as it did. A second example is the July 2007 warning of LaRouche of a coming banking crisis based on the move toward what we now know as mortgage-backed securities, derivative markets, secondary bets, you might say, on mortgages. Again, a speculative system moving away from a system of physical economic production. And when these crises hit, what was the response? Bailout, low interest credit, full speed ahead with the speculative system. not even a moment of reflection of what caused the crisis. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has taken up the mantle from her husband and is working to bring together an alliance of forces around the globe to reject this system, which is heading now over the cliff. And again, the most recent move toward this was the 2019 crisis, what was called the repo crisis, the fact that corporations were not able to cover the interest on their debt. They had to go to overnight loans called repurchasing agreements, which were arranged with commercial banks. And at a certain point, the banks backed away. They recognized the debt was unsustainable. And so the Federal Reserve moved in September of 2019. And the policy of quantitative easing led to several aggressive approaches of funny money. After 2008, 2009, over $20 trillion went into bailouts. After September 2019, again, over $20 trillion. And at the same time, increased betting on new financial instruments such as derivatives and swaptions and so on. Now, the move from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening, well, that's what precipitated the present banking crisis. But it's not one step alone, it's this progression over years of an attack on physical economic production, whether it's because of green policy, whether it's because of short-term profits, whatever the reason, it's been the degradation of the physical productive capability of not just the United States, but the Western economies as a whole. Now, here's a crucial point in this: the connection between this and the war economy and the war danger. The idea of permanent warfare. It's not just defense budgets to provide money for the military-industrial complex, although that's a factor. We just had a new budget of $845 billion for the American defense sector and demand that NATO countries increase their spending. So there is an idea that, well, if you flood the defense and security services with money, maybe that will have an effect on the real economy. But the reality here is that they're doing this to make sure there's no challenge to the rules-based order, which is essentially a City of London Wall Street policy backed by NATO and US military especially. No resistance is allowed from sovereign nations. Well, what happens when you have sovereign nations that are powerful enough to resist the military threat that are moving toward a new system? And that's where we are today. The Russians and the Chinese will not give up sovereignty. They're committed to the idea of defending their nation. And if you look at the background to the Ukraine war, it's based on a decision not to defend security interests of the Ukrainian people or the sovereignty of Ukraine or their freedom and democracy. They have no democracy in Ukraine. That's a fraud invented by Chatham House and Atlantic Council and the talking heads of NATO. The reality is it's a campaign to destroy Russia, which began after the fall of the Soviet Union with the shock therapy policy imposed by the West on Russia, which led to a severe demographic crisis. It was the looting of the Russian raw materials. It was creating partners with Russian oligarchs, but it was largely to defend and create profits for the Western banking system. And it was stopped when Yeltsin was left office and Putin came in, and it was reversed. The shock therapy policy was a policy of stealing. This is what they want to do today. They want to take Russia apart to grab the raw material wealth of the nation, because Russia is one of the nations that's blessed with the most abundant strategic metals, oil and gas, special minerals, and so on, as well as land, fertilizer capability, and so on. The idea of the Ukraine war is to use Ukraine to destroy Russia. Now, That's what the military-industrial complex does on behalf of the broader network of corporate cartels that are controlling not just the financial system, but the political system through media and through the election process. Now, here's the question. Why not stop the saber rattling? Why do we have to go to war against China, against Russia? Why not stop the saber rattling and do diplomacy and then sit back and figure out what can we do to stop this systemic financial meltdown? Because this is not just the US. It's affecting all of Western Europe. You have strike wave in the United Kingdom. You have demonstrations in France. You have economies of major countries, Greece, Italy, Spain, collapsing. On top of this now, we have the decision to bail out the U.S. banks. The bailouts in the past of 20 plus trillion after 2008 and then again after 2019 will be peanuts compared to what's going to have to go into this today. And especially if there's a derivative blowout, which would threaten the pile of over $2 quadrillion worth of derivatives. Now, just yesterday, Moody's Investor Services put out a downgraded outlook for the whole financial system, saying it's moved now from stable to negative. And what we're seeing is, since last Wednesday, the 10 largest banks in the United States have lost $187 billion in market value. We're seeing an absolute collapse, which was not what may have been triggered by the Silicon Valley Bank, but in reality is based on this whole period of 50 plus years of a move into a speculative system of unsustainable debt and a cutback of real physical production. So that's why I want you to watch Helga Zepp-LaRouche's statement and to support our call for this emergency conference. And at the same time, at the center of this emergency conference is Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws to turn the country back around, the United States back around, but also the U.S. allies and, in fact, the global South, which is already moving toward economic sanity, away from the petrodollar system, the speculative bubble, into investment in long-term gains in physical production. That's what's necessary. So study Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws, which will be appended to the description section, and look at Mrs. LaRouche's call for an emergency conference, and join us to fight for this, to take power away from those who are responsible for the systemic destruction of the physical economy, partly based on their commitment to depopulate the world. So thanks for joining me. I know this is hard for some people to grasp, and it's a lot to chew on, but really it's up to the people to move to take power away from these criminal speculators who don't care about your future, your children's future, who are willing to have ongoing wars, including the possibility of a nuclear war, rather than give up their control of the so-called rules-based order. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.